issue, my problem is about genres in general, and historical kind of throws me as well. So I get that your story was about a person back there that you have a personal relationship with. In your case, is it historical because it happened a while back, or there's also some actual history going on sometimes?
Well, it depends on the book. I mean, in some of them, you know, the one set during the Great Seattle Fire was, you know, 1889, because that's when it happened, and that's what I wanted to write about. Sometimes it's historical just because I like writing historical novels, and so I set it in a time and place, you know, back then, and I pull in the history of whatever was happening in the place. A lot of times, like for Inamorata, for example, the story I wanted to set in Venice, but it didn't actually happen, and there was no history that I managed, that I got to pull in. It was just these characters in this time period.
Oh, okay. All right.
Are you asking when does it become historical? Like how old it is?
Well, this whole idea of a historical novel, I mean, if you write something in the past, I guess that's historical because it's in the past.
Right.
Or is it because there's actually some history in it, or some historical personage in it, or something? So,
I think all those things can be the case.
oh, okay.
Or any of them, or all of them.
Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, I think the biggest qualification for a historical novel is very simple and very broad, which is it's a novel set at a historical time period.
Okay.
So,
And my follow-up question would be, like, when was that? Is that like last year or last decade?
So
Or?
this is a good question, and I've heard some people say that it's when no one is living anymore from that time period, it becomes historical. So
But they call
if
World War
you're
II.
writing about they're starting to call World War II historical. Most of the gentlemen who were in World War II are now beyond us. So yeah, but 1960s, maybe not quite historical. Yeah.
probably the 50s they would call historical, but 60s are sort of just, I don't know. I don't know.
I've also heard that it can be measured before you remember it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
There you
Oh,
go.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Our daughters think that the Vietnam War is history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, they don't remember it, so of course.
Thank you.
Did women really wear tight dresses in 1880?
Bustles. So the skirts were very tight in front and bustled in the back, and they were very difficult to move and walk in. So you had yards and yards of fabric back there, but the front was tight.
Front was tight.
Did you pick Venice so that you could go there for research?
I wish. No, I didn't go there. No, I picked Venice because I had a friend who went there, and she called me from Venice, and she said, "Oh my God, this is your city. You have to write a book set here." And I'm like, "Yeah, right." You know. And she said, "No, really, really." And so I went to sort of just see what there was because it sounded intriguing, and she, you know, talked about it. And you know, I'd always loved New Orleans, and she said Venice was like New Orleans cubed. And I thought, okay, well, I'll at least look at it. And I stumbled across all of these old, you know, it was one of the stops on the Grand Tour that people, you know, lots of young men and artists and everything else toured Europe looking at art places, and Venice was one of the places on that Grand Tour in the 19th century. And so all these people had written journals, and there were all these travel logs, and, you know, so I had Murray guidebooks and Baedeker guidebooks from that period telling me exactly where to go and exactly what hotels and exactly what money. And then I had all these journals from William Dean Howells, who was like the American ambassador to Venice at that time period. And they were extremely detailed about their experiences, and you know, I just fell in love with it through their work. You know, I mean, that was really it. I just, you know, I've been Byron is the poet has been one of my favorites since I was, I don't know, like 13. So I've read almost everything I can find about him, and I knew he had been in Venice for a period of time. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go back and read that biography and see what he says about it. And then it was just like, oh, I can think of a story here. And that's how that evolved.
Other questions? Did you have? Well, actually, I was gonna ask, do you have a favorite place to go look for research? Like newspaper articles or, like this, I hear the interest in Venice got you looking at these other documents. Do you have a place where you go look first?
You know, it's interesting because it used to be, you know, until actually very recently, like say the last 10 years, that if you wanted to do research and you wanted to look at these primary sources, which is what I always tried to use, you had to go to the library and they would be in the stacks and you would have to do a lot of research to get them, and that meant that whatever you read, you were feeding on the bibliographies of those books and trying to find old dissertations, old theses, old journals, old diaries. Because one of the cool things about the 19th century was that everything was an adventure. I mean, the world felt so new with the Industrial Revolution and people able to travel in ways they hadn't been able to travel before. And it wasn't like there was TV or, you know, people weren't using, there were photographers, but the general people weren't using photography. And so when somebody went somewhere, they wrote everything about their experience so that they could bring it home and share it with the people at home. And a lot of these journals, they would self-publish and give them out as Christmas gifts to people. So you have all this stuff that is just out there, you know, thank God for their like urge to write everything down, but it was in the stacks. And because of things like, well, not just Google Books, but like the University of Michigan and Cornell University embarked on a program called the Making of America Project. And what they have done is gone and scanned in 19th century books, and that means journals, magazines, not newspaper articles, but magazine articles, so like Harper Bazaar articles and all these things from the 19th century, old like agricultural manuals, everything you can think of, and they have it in a searchable database. So all of a sudden now, all this stuff that you had to, you know, if I wanted to study the Seattle fire 10 years ago, I had to go to the Northwest Room at the UW Suzzallo Library, and you can't take anything out. That means I'm camped there for weeks at a time. Now it's all online. It's amazing. You just have to be able to focus in and find it. And, you know, over time, I've just developed a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah, right. The King County Library System, 19th century newspapers. I love reading old newspapers because I was writing about the 19th century. Now when we get back a little farther in time, that's more difficult. And in addition to the sources you mentioned, I also love the University of Washington Library. That's great. And I like going to museums. They've already got the interpretive displays. They have objects that you can see what was worn and, you know, outfits and all of that kind of thing. So I take photos of interpretive displays so that when I get home and I want to look at what they said about the Oregon Trail or whatever, then I have it on my camera. I can read it.
You ever get a fact wrong that you regret? and what would you do if you learned that, say, a detailed accident, you know, just was not quite right?
That happened to me. Luckily, I caught it before the book went to press, but there's a famous German restaurant in Cleveland where I had my characters meeting all the time. And then suddenly I saw that the place actually wasn't built until 1800. And I was setting all these scenes in it in the 1850s and 60s. So then I had to quickly backpedal and find another place for them to meet. But I was, I was able to change it.
I've had that happen too. You know what?
Isn't that what a good editor is for?
A copy editor, but they don't check your historical research anymore. It's too hard. They don't.
Not with the internet. So.
No, it's too hard. I mean, I had one copy editor catch that I had a character who was alive, who was actually dead at the time that I had written it, so that got fixed. But most of the stuff, like if you say a police station's on Mulberry Street, they don't check that stuff. They assume you're the expert.
Would it really matter though in the case of the restaurant? I mean, you know, it's fiction.
It only matters to people who know.
And there's always somebody who knows. And they're really happy to tell you.
Yeah, but it's fiction.
Yeah, but you know, you're writing historical fiction, so you want it to be as real as you can make it, you know. It would be akin to, you know, if you wrote a story in modern day Seattle and you put the library on 2nd Avenue.
Well, you know, in Shakespeare's histories, he was constantly rearranging them.
See what? And that's an excellent argument, and I will use that in the next time. Thank you. I meant to do that.
Does authenticity then reside in the believability of something rather than the actuality?
Yes, the perception of reality is way, way more important than reality itself. If something sounds false in a book, it doesn't matter. And this is the other thing that you have to remember. You aren't going to be there to explain to your reader the truth of what actually happened. And all they'll see is that you're wrong. And whether they're wrong or not, they see that you are. And so it is, I know, but it is the perception. But the point is that when you're writing a novel, your goal is to create an illusion for a reader that they don't want to get out of. So the last thing you want to do is put something in there that brings them out of that illusion. That means they put the book down. That means they don't want to read you. That means they don't read your next one.
And I found too that when I, as a writer, am faking it, it shows. When I'm just guessing, it doesn't sound as believable as when I know for a fact or think I know for a fact what I'm writing about. So it's really a good idea not to fake it, or to fake it as little as possible.
Or to fake it really well.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about foreshadowing an event when you're writing?
A historical event? Well, it depends on what you can know and what you can't know. So, you know, if you're going to say, in the fields the slaves sang not knowing that freedom was only 60 years away, I think that's bad foreshadowing. So it's like, what can you draw as a observer living in that time? What can you extrapolate from what's actually going on? You can extrapolate all kinds of things from what you see in the history of what's going on you now. But your character has to be firmly entrenched in his time. He cannot know what he cannot know.
So there was foreshadowing in the blacksmithing story, I noticed, that you referred to the number of orders being down, which suggests that, I mean, without even having read the book, that, okay, this guy is going to be apprenticed, but there's going to be some challenges with the blacksmithing industry.
But
It's
there's
obvious
going
in
to
the
be
title.
the financial panic of
Yeah.
1857.
Yeah.
Yes.
So but there was that one sentence of foreshadowing there in that excerpt.
But you know, your reader brings all kinds of stuff to the work too, you know. So, you know, when you say something like that and, you know, your reader is going to read into it, okay, this isn't going to be what he thinks it's going to be. And that's the kind of foreshadowing you want to do.
Yeah, it's dangerous to say something like that and then have there not be a financial panic. You're building the world of a story. So,
Would you say historical fiction is, because of the need for accuracy as best you can, that historical fiction is harder than, say, science fiction?
No, I think it's world building of the same ilk. You know, in science fiction, you are building a world and you have to have laws and rules that make sense. And you can't, you know, you have to have a world that makes sense. And in historical fiction, you're doing the same thing. You're world building in the same way you would in fantasy or science fiction. The difference is there's a lot of familiar stuff there that people already know about that you're building in. So my personal belief would be that science fiction would be harder. To do it well would be harder, you know, in terms of world building.
I was wondering where you got the vocabulary of the character, the first person character. It seemed like reminiscent of the books that I've read from that period.
oh, well, one real advantage I had, speaking of primary source material, was that I had 36 letters written by this character that had been translated. And so even though I didn't know what words he said in conversation and scenes, I knew kind of how he spoke, although the letters are in German, and so this was a translation. But still, there was sort of a voice when I lived with those letters for long enough that kind of came out. Yeah. They were German-speaking German, but English. That probably makes no sense at all.
Any other
Purposes?
questions?
Well, let's thank Megan and Claire